Secretary General Ace Magashule is expected to deliver a keynote address at an event in solidarity with Cuba to mark 30 years since the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale in honor of former President Nelson Mandela's legacy in the year of centenary. We now cross live to my colleague Peter Ndoro at Freedom Park in Pretoria. Good afternoon, Peter. Welcome to the SABC News Desk. 30 years on, and this sweet but rare victory over apartheid forces etched in our hearts forever.
Kirshni, thanks very much indeed. Yes, a very good afternoon to you. We are in Pretoria at Freedom Park, and in fact we're at a place called the Sanctuary, and right around the Sanctuary is a wall, and for those that have ever been to Freedom Park, this is quite a memorable wall. It's the wall of names, and there you'll find names of people that have given their lives to liberate the continent in one way or another, and have contributed to humanity in general. And so today in part really is about remembering a famous battle that took place in 1987, 1988. 6 months it raged in the southeast of Cuba, the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale. And whilst Cuito Cuanavale itself might be a small village, insignificant really in terms of its geography, in the end the battle itself was very significant in the liberation struggles and the liberation aspirations of Southern African countries, Namibia, South Africa. And it was at this battle that many regard as a turning point as what happened next in terms of the countries getting liberated. Here today we're going to witness a wreath-laying ceremony which will be remembering some of the soldiers that lost their lives there. And on this wall of names that I was talking about, more than 2,000 Cuban soldiers who were part of the struggles across the continent in various countries, and some of them who lost their lives at the battle at Cuito Cuanavale are remembered in particular. And I'm hoping a little bit later on we might be able to speak to some of the surviving soldiers that were there, because Cuba supported the battle, the MPLA forces at the time that were busy fighting its own civil war, but South Africa was getting involved, Americans were involved, we had the Russians involved, and so they were all kind of involved in this strategic battle that took place at that critical time. I will be unpacking a lot of the story in a short while, but I just want to introduce you to a couple of guests that I've got here now. And the first one is Professor Tula Simpson, who's in many ways a historian, and he's written an epic book about the history of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And in some ways, MK were involved in Angola, perhaps not very directly at Quito itself.
They're playing a very important role in the context of the overall operations taking place in Angola in 87 and 88. Umkhonto we Sizwe fighters were involved in the north of the country. UNITA, who were fighting against the Angolan government, were trying to spread guerrilla warfare across the country to try and spread the Angolan military forces. And when that happened, the Angolans called on Umkhonto we Sizwe to engage in counterinsurgency operations. So it was a guerrilla organization getting involved in counter-guerrilla operations. That was Umkhonto we Sizwe's military involvement, but I think, and you may also have interviews with those involved here later today, you had South Africans involved in the southeastern parts of Angola, where the most intense fighting was, engaged in translation work there as well. So there was a very extensive South African involvement during those campaigns in 87 and 88.
All right, so today, I mean, this year is the centenary of Nelson Mandela, and he was a great friend with Cuba and never shied away from it, even under pressure from the Americans. And so the Cubans want to be showing solidarity with the South Africans at this particular time as they remember what happened at Quito, and to perhaps talk to us a little bit about the friendship, not just with Nelson Mandela and Cuba itself, but the South African people in general. The freedom, the Friendship Society of South Africa and Cuba. Lefika Chetty joins me now. Tell us a little bit about how Nelson Mandela set up this friendship between Cuba and South Africa.
Yes. In 1996, former President Mandela had established formally Focus, as it is more commonly known, at a then regional solidarity conference in South Africa. And the reason that the decision was taken at that point by the alliance collectively, by the ANC, the Communist Party, by COSATU, was that we needed a voice in civil society to be able to speak about this historic relationship with Cuba, that didn't only go back to what we're celebrating today, the 30 years of Cuito Cuanavale in 1988. It went back as far as 1978, when Alex Laguma was posted to Cuba on the request of the Cuban government to open up a mission in Cuba and solidify the ties between the ANC and Cuba. So the formation of Focus was one that was organic, was natural and expected, and therefore today we still see that the role of Focus is not only in terms of creating public opinion on issues around the blockade, issues around the occupation of Guantanamo Bay, and as we had whilst the Cuban Five were in prison, and we saw the historic visit of the Cuban Five in 2015, it is also to encourage people-to-people interaction, to encourage exchanges, such as the Alex Laguma Brigade, as we call it, after our veteran.
All right, and one of the projects that you're working on currently is helping the Cubans in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma.
Absolutely. When we had learnt of the devastation that the hurricane had caused throughout the island, we had put out a call to South Africans to say, let us make contributions in this regard. And of course, that was heeded. And today we will be handing over that contribution as a part of that international solidarity. I think that President Samora Machel had so clearly put to us when he said to us that international solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains towards the same objective. And so the heed of South Africans to the plight of Cubans was just about that.
And Tula, coming back to this battle, I mean, you know, Fidel Castro was resolute in his determination to make sure that people enjoy the freedoms that they deserved on the continent. A lot of countries supported the liberation struggles with support in kind, military hardware, but he put men on the ground. And by the time they left, I think there was something in the order of 400,000 that had come to Africa to assist. And many lost their lives in Angola. This was an enormous sacrifice that they made on behalf of the Angolans.
They called it Operation Carlota. It was after the name of a female rebel leader during a slave revolt in Cuban history. So it had a lot of significant historical resonance within Cuba. It was a very significant commitment. And when we speak about the decisive campaigns which Cuito Cuanavale was a part of, the Cubans actually sent their elite 50th Division, which is basically the most effective forces in the Cuban army. And Castro later said that the defense of Cuba was basically sacrificed in order to try and ensure that there was a successful outcome to this campaign. And with regards to how it's remembered in Cuba, it's remembered as being a campaign which was successfully accomplished. When Castro spoke before the non-aligned movement in 1988, he said that the history of South Africa will be written before and after Cuito Cuanavale.
So how significant was the contribution in the end when we saw Namibia get its independence, early 90s, and we saw South Africa political prisoners getting freed? How much of that can we attribute to some of the guys that we're going to be talking to here that fought bravely at Cuanavale?
By the time the South African Defence Force called the border war reached its greatest intensity, South Africa had accepted that Namibia would be independent, but there's a question of under what kind of political, economic and social order. The campaigns in 87 and 88 were critical in dictating that it would be a swapper government which would come to power. It would be secure in its borders with regards to being protected by the changes which were also going to happen in South Africa as well. So it was critical in terms of determining what kind of independence for Namibia would take place.
Lefika, unfortunately we've run out of time. There's so many things that I could have talked about, but hopefully we can get to chat a little bit more later on, because there's so much still to come here. As I said, a wreath-laying ceremony will take place. We'll see a number of delegations from Cuba and South Africa being part of that, including former President Kgalema Motlanthe is going to be a keynote speaker a little bit later on. So when we come back to you a little bit later on, hopefully much of that will be playing out, and we'll talk to some of the role players that were key in that famous battle that we're commemorating here today. Kirshni?
Thank you, Peter. That was our Peter Ndoro coming to us live from Freedom Park in Pretoria, where South Africa, Cuba and Angola are marking 30 years of the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale, in which the apartheid army forces were defeated.